Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be giving my picks for week 2 of the summer stage for the 2023 Overwatch League season. But before we jump into that, real quick, I just want to talk a little bit about the news that we got yesterday about the Overwatch League from the article on The Verge. I am going to do a whole video on it tomorrow on Friday, just to get a little bit more time to think it over. I was at work when the story dropped, so I've really just kind of been trying to process what's been going on, read about it, and kind of get my thoughts on it. So expect a full video on it, but I did tweet about it. If you want some simple kind of general thoughts, check the link in the description for my Twitter account. You can see what I said about it there. But for now, let's just take a look at the week ahead for the Overwatch League and talk about the games that are going to be played this weekend in the league. The first game, of course, is in the Eastern region. As always, we have the Guangzhou Charge taking on the Seoul Infernal. Two pretty good teams in the league, in the region. Infernal, arguably the best team in the Eastern region. Charge, pretty good. They did lose to the Spark last week, while the Infernal are sitting in a nice undefeated 2-0 plus 5 right now. So definitely an interesting matchup here. I think that the Charge are going to have to really try to bounce back. I think the Charge are in a pretty rough spot when you consider the auto-qualification. If they want to really auto-qualify for the playoffs, they have to have a really, really good qualifiers and knockouts run, and it just seems like they are going to struggle a little bit. They are certainly not the world beater that they seemed to be at the beginning of the season, while the Seoul Infernal seem to have kind of just gotten better and better as time has gone on. I think it's a close matchup in a lot of ways, but I really do feel like what we have seen from the Infernal has just been much, much better. They've looked more consistent. They've looked to have the higher peaks, and so I think the Infernal are going to take the win in this series. I don't think it's going to be a particularly close one. I have the Infernal winning by a score of 3-0. A lot of games this season have been 3-0s, even when they're two teams that seemingly are both pretty good, so it's hard to really call anything but a 3-0 in a matchup where two teams look pretty good, but ultimately the Infernal are just a better team and walk away with this one. Up next, we have the renewal of an age-old rivalry from the 2021 season, the Dallas Fuel taking on the Shanghai Dragons. Not nearly as flashy of a rivalry as it once was, but Dragons look a lot better, of course, with Fate joining the team. They won against the Seoul Dynasty. They did lose as well to, I think it was Dreamers. So they are certainly still working on a lot, and they still have to improve. But generally speaking, I do like what I have seen from them. But right now, I think the Dallas Fuel do look like the stronger team. I think they've improved quite a bit since the first half of the season. I think that they had that very rough opening to the season. But after that point, I thought they looked pretty good outside of their series where they fell to the Infernal in the knockouts. I think that's really the point where I think they're probably the third or fourth best team in the region. I don't think they look better than teams like the Infernal or the Spark even, but I think they're still pretty good. I think they should be able to beat a Shanghai Dragons team that I still think is getting some stuff together. It could be an interesting one. It could be pretty close, but I'm going to go in favor of the Dallas Fuel by a score of 3-0. Because right now, Dallas looks very good. They're firing all cylinders, and so I think they're going to take this one by a pretty dominant 3-0 scoreline. Up next, we have a pretty interesting contenders matchup between Dreamers and Poker Face. The two teams that I put at the top of my contenders teams for the power rankings in this region. I think they are the two best-looking contenders teams. Dreamers had a nice week last week, getting two pretty good wins, putting themselves in a top 3 spot, 2-0 plus 4. Pretty good from them, honestly. I think we'll see them look pretty good and pretty strong as we get further and further into this tournament cycle. I think they have the pieces that really make me the most confident of any of the contenders teams. They haven't played the likes of the Infernal or the Fuel or the Spark yet, so we don't know necessarily what they are right this second, but I think right now what we've seen from them, they look to be performing better than Poker Face, who just did not look very good in the opening week here in the summer stage. And so I'm going to go in favor of Dreamers by a score of 3-0. 2-1. I think it could be decently close because, like I said, I think these teams are decently similar and decently close together when it comes to contenders teams. But I think Dreamers has just looked better as a whole. Even with the new pieces they have, I still think they've looked better. So I think they're going to take this one somewhat one-sided, but not the most one-sided series I think that we'll get this week. Up next, we have the San Francisco Shock taking on the Los Angeles Valiant. Valiant coming off their first win of the season. Vibes are good. Energy's high. Definitely recipe for potentially them doing even better. But I think when you see the Shock, who looked a very, 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 very much improved team after adding Luke Mito and Renko and adding Probe and Striker, they look a lot better. I think they're going to be a much harder team to beat this time around than they were in the first half of the season. The Valiant, I think, look a lot better. I think they definitely deserve credit. Liar and Seeker were incredible in their most recent matchups in that game against the Gladiators in particular. So I think there's room to think the Valiant could do something here. But really, I think the Shock are just a little bit too strong for the Valiant to overcome. And I think that it will be a win for the Shock. And I think it'll be pretty one-sided. I think it'll be a 3-0. I think there's a potential for a lot of 3 Overwatch this weekend. There's just a lot of games that feel pretty one-sided, feel pretty lopsided. And so for me, Shock 3-0, relatively easy win over a Valiant team that's improving, but so are the Shock, and that to me is the scary thing if you are any team other than the Shock. Up next, we have the Boston Uprising taking on the Toronto Defiant. An interesting matchup. We saw this in the Pro-Am. Big story there when the Defiant upset the Uprising. Uprising looked obviously good last weekend, getting a win over the Houston Outlaws. Houston, team we rate pretty highly, considering they were second overall in the midseason madness. But they had a rough weekend last weekend. Boston, big part of that. And so now you have Boston coming in against a resurging Toronto team that I think made good moves with Spectra and Opener as the additions. I think they played very well last weekend. Obviously, they had a little bit of struggle against Vancouver. I think it's still a good team, and I think that is no shame in that. But I definitely think their highs look a lot better and their peaks look better than where they were. So I think this one should be an interesting matchup. Uprising, with their coaching change, bringing in Moby Dick, I think they also are in an interesting spot. So these are two teams that kind of look like they're getting better, but I think the Uprising proved last week that they are still one of the juggernauts of the league. Their talent is still some of the best in the league, and they still look like one of the best teams in the league. And I think that they should be able to beat the Defiant. I think the Defiant could take a map, and they have the talent and they have potential because we've seen them, like I said, improve. So I'm going to say it's a 3-1 score for this one because I think that there's possibility of this being a somewhat close series. But I do think Boston should be favored decently heavily because right now they just look to be one of the best teams in the world. And I think when you have the talent they have and you click at the right time, this is a very scary roster that could be on this kind of crash course towards the top of the league. I still think they're one of the best teams in terms of how they played Atlanta in the first half of the season. And I think with the coaching change, they might be even better. So yeah, I'm excited to see where they go from here. Next matchup we have is the Houston Outlaws taking on the New York Excelsior. Like I said about Houston before, rough weekend from them last weekend. New York, on the other hand, very good weekend from them. Moved up in the standings quite a bit. And got a couple of dubs over some of the lower-end teams in the region with the Vegas Eternal and the London Spitfire. Now they have a much tougher week, having to go up against Houston as their first out. And as much as I think Houston struggled last week, I think that they struggled against two of the best teams in the world. And I think there's not a lot of reason to think they'll struggle against New York, who technically, if you want to be accurate, is right below Houston in the standings. So in terms of standings, this is the 4 versus the 5, but there's a pretty big gap between Houston and everybody else. If Houston's 4 and New York's 5, there's a chasm there. Really, I think that is pretty big. I think Houston should be favored to win in this series pretty convincingly. Mayhem Uprising, yes, they beat the Outlaws. Those are two very good teams. We're talking about the Outlaws losing the two teams that finished in the top 4 for the midseason madness. We're not talking about Houston losing to Valiant or Spitfire or even like New York. They lost to two of the best teams in the world. It's not embarrassing to lose to two of those really good teams, even if you are one of the best teams in the world, right? I don't think they'll have trouble with New York. I think they should be able to beat New York with ease. As much as like what New York has done, I think that they're not really up to the level of the Outlaws yet. So I think the Outlaws are going to take this one by a score of 3-0. Sorry, New York. I am a fan, but I just don't really think Houston is an opponent that right this second you can get past very easily. Up next, we have O2 Blast taking on Seoul Infernal, moving into Saturday, now in the APAC region. A shame that this matchup, when we last got it, was very, very good, and it won't be nearly as interesting this time around, considering the major roster moves that the O2 Blast roster underwent, where pretty much every single player in this team from the spring stage joined the Overwatch League, except for Top Dragon, who went over to Dreamers. So it's a very new look O2 Blast roster against a very tried and true Infernal roster that just looks very good, very strong. I think this will be pretty one-sided for obvious reasons in favor of the Infernal. They just look better. They've looked better as a whole this season. They're the stronger team. They look like one of the best teams in the region. So I think it's a 3-0 easy for the Infernal. Not really much reason to think that they should lose to an O2 Blast roster that still feels like they're kind of getting their stuff together. They don't really feel like they're fully where they need to be yet. So give me the Infernal to take this one. Up next, we have the Guangzhou Charge taking on Panthera, another Overwatch League versus Contenders matchup. I think this is another somewhat one-sided affair. As much as the Charge have looked a little bit weaker, and they haven't looked great at times, I think they do have a lot of talent, and they do have a lot of kind of really high-end performances. And when you compare them to what the Panthera roster has, Panthera is just, in my opinion, one of the lower-end Contenders teams in this region. They just don't look super good and super strong. So I think the Charge should win this one. Also, relatively easily, I think a 3-0 victory is very likely here for the Charge. They just look better as a team. It's a pretty one-sided, I think, affair here. And the Charge walk away from this one victorious and bounce back a bit after a potentially rough start to their stage earlier in the week. Next is the Hangzhou Spark taking on the Seoul Dynasty. This is an interesting one. I don't really think the Dynasty are in the best of positions after what we saw from them last week. Though I think it's the first weekend, first game, growing pains. I think they looked better in their second match, especially in their second match. Obviously, I think the addition of EasyHan and now the addition of Vindane, which finally got announced, will help this roster as they transition into a more main support focused lineup. I did not love what they had with Lee Sumin Krillin. They let Lee Sumin go, which is kind of a surprise to me. Now they're definitely going to focus on Krillin being the flex support and Vindame as your main support. I really do think that this should be a better look for this team. Yes, Vindame struggled a bit earlier in the year with the shock. I think back to the environment that he was most successful in will be good for him and for the team in general, because I think that they really struggled not having a really good main support player, which held them back quite a bit. So I think they'll definitely be improved as time goes on in this second half of the season. I think that change with getting Vindane was really, really big. But I still think the Spark right now look like the better team. I think the Spark are still one of the best teams in this region, if not the best team in this region. When they're at their peak, they're absolutely unbelievable as a roster and as a team. So I think the Spark should still take this one. I'm going to say it is a score of 3-0. I think it could be a little bit closer. It's hard to tell. Like I said, we haven't seen the Dynasty with Vindame yet this season. There's different pieces and parts here, and it's not exactly the same roster as what they found so much success on last year. Obviously, Smurf being on this team last year helped a lot. The Spark to me is more consistent, and I think they should be able to walk away from this one with the dub. Up next, we have Shanghai Dragons versus Poker Face. Very interesting matchup here. Shanghai Dragons, one of the weaker teams in the Overwatch League side of things in this Eastern region. Poker Face, one of the top-looking Contenders teams. Could be an interesting matchup. There's some potential here. I think it could be close based on the fact that Shanghai struggled against Dreamers last week. That is not a good look for a team that is rebuilding, that did make a huge addition, bringing in a very tested and well-known and well-loved veteran player in Fate. and struggling to beat Dreamers, that they didn't beat them, right? They couldn't beat them. They didn't even get past them. So that to me is a point of concern for the Dragons. I don't think Poker Face is as good as Dreamers, so I think Shanghai has a better chance now. They'll have had an extra week to practice and play and get their kind of roster together and really kind of figure out what they're good at and what they're best at. So I do think that Shanghai should be the favorite to win this game, but I definitely think Poker Face has what it takes to push them. You consider just how much talent on that roster was in the Overwatch League in years past. So I think this is going to be probably the closest game of the week. One of the harder ones to predict. I am going to say it is a 3-2 game for Shanghai, who I do think, with the way that we've seen Viper and Hisu play, they've been phenomenal. I think as the Fate reintegration keeps going, this team will look a lot better, and I think they'll be able to take this one. But I do think Poker Face will put up a good fight. I think they have what it takes to put up a fight when you consider the just names on this roster. I think that this will be a pretty good, fun, and interesting matchup to watch. Up next is the first big pick game of the week. We move over to the Western region for the Boston Uprising taking on the Florida Mayhem. Obviously, this matchup, when we saw it in the midseason matchups, was a little one-sided in favor of the Mayhem, but I think the Uprising's coaching change clearly has done a lot. These two teams are both coming off wins over the Houston Outlaws, so a lot of kind of things to hope for if you are these teams, things on your plate, games that you're hoping that do go your way, and this is a really great matchup between two very, very good high-level teams in the Western region. I think that the Boston is very hard to predict right now against some of these upper-level teams. Obviously, they beat Houston. That was a big, big match for them. I think it was a huge game for them. Houston, I don't know what was going on for them last week. Mayhem, a little bit of a different animal. They looked very good last week, very dominant. And I think that they had a much better performance in Houston than even Boston did. Not as if Boston was bad, but Houston did not look as good against Florida as it did against Boston. So I think you have to favor Florida for that reason. Plus, last time they played, Florida beat them pretty convincingly. I still don't love that Boston doesn't have a traditional flex DPS player. I think that is ultimately the biggest thing that will hold them back from winning a title this year. If they do not sign any kind of traditional flex DPS player, I don't think Decay really is the guy you want playing that role. He's not super comfortable on it. Traditionally, it's not his heroes, so it's tough for me to think that the Uprising right now are the better team. But I think it'll be a close giga-banger of a series. That's what I'm hoping for. Usually the games we think will be really good disappoint the most. So I'm hoping this one's at least good, but I'm going to give this one to the Mayhem by a score of 3-2. I hope it's good. I hope it's a really competitive matchup because I really like both of these teams this year. And I especially want to see Boston kind of do a little bit more to get over that ledge that they seemingly have struggled against some of the top teams this year. They got that win over Houston. Can they keep that rolling, get some other good wins? That's what I want to see from this team. Up next, we have the San Francisco Shock taking on the London Spitfire. I don't think this game will be particularly close. I don't think London looks very good right now. I think the Shock had a very good last weekend. I think they'll be better, even more so going forward. I think that the additions of Luke Mino and Rengo and Probe and Striker have done a lot to help the team out. I think they've solved some of the issues they had. I think that has been the biggest thing that I look at with this Shock roster and see meaningful change there. I don't know if they would have necessarily gotten rid of Heesang if Vancouver hadn't come calling. But I think that what they have now with Probe and Striker alongside Proper is a very, very good look. I think it helps their team out a lot. It opens them up to really run the stuff that they really want to be able to run. So I think the Shock are going to win this one pretty convincingly. London has struggled a lot. I feel bad for Sauna because he seemingly is kind of like the big addition they wanted to make at the midseason point, thinking that he's kind of the guy who could really help revitalize this roster. So far, doesn't really seem to be going that way. So give me this one for the Shock by a score of 3-0. Unfortunately, I just don't think the Spitfire have what it takes right now to beat a Shock team that I do think, despite some of their struggles, does look good right now, and I think will be pretty easily able to take this one away. Up next is the Atlanta Reign taking on the Houston Outlaws. Rematch of the Midseason Madness Finals, rematch of the Midseason Madness Upper Finals as well. And honestly, this should, in theory, be a big pick game, but I just don't know if I feel like Houston is going to be able to compete with Atlanta. Last time they played was a one-sided affair. Obviously, they had that one close game in the upper bracket finals, but Houston had a rough week last week. Atlanta still looks very, very good. This really is kind of the last challenge for the Reign. If they win here, I would be shocked they lost another game. They might have to play Florida and Atlanta, or Florida and Boston later, which if they keep playing well, that definitely could be games if Atlanta loses. But I just don't feel great about what we saw from Houston last week. They have to be at top 4 and be able to beat Atlanta, and they did not look it last week. So I think you have to be able to pick Atlanta here. I think you have to favor Atlanta in any game this season until we have reason to believe not to. And I don't have that reason yet. So give me Atlanta in this one by a score of 3-0. I'm sorry, Houston fans. I do like your team quite a lot. But I just right now think the Atlanta Reign look too good to drop this series to Houston. Up next, moving back over to the APAC region, we have my second big pick game of the weekend, which is Dallas Fuel taking on Dreamers. A little preview before when I mentioned that Dreamers hadn't played a team like Dallas Fuel yet. But here we go. They play Dallas Fuel, who right now, as things stand, is the top-ranked team in the Eastern region. They haven't lost a map yet. They didn't have the toughest opponents in the first week. I will admit, they lucked out. They played Poker Face, and they played O2 Blast. And they have another Contenders team now on their plate. But this time, it is the best-looking Contenders team. And I think there's a very real possibility that Dreamers pushes Fuel the distance. Do not sleep on Dreamers. I am telling you right now. If any Contenders team is going to get out of this group, is going to move on from knockouts and make it into the playoffs, it is going to be Dreamers. That is what I am going to throw out there right now. I think they are the most complete of all of these Contenders rosters. They have a lot of really good players. So if anyone were able to do it, I think it's Dreamers. And this is one of their big tests. If they can get past the Fuel here, I think this roster will just continue to grow and improve and improve. And considering they finished second in the Spring Stage Qualifiers, they could very easily find themselves with a very high finish. Another second place finish, a first place finish potentially. That could propel them into the actual playoffs if a team like the Spark fall apart, or the Infernal fall apart, or some of these teams that maybe the Dragons go in this late run, or the Dynasty go in this late run that knocks some of these other top teams off, and that helps Dreamers get into that position. I think it's a very interesting matchup. I think Dreamers look very, very good. I think what we've seen from the Fuel this stage so far has been very, very good. It's very different from the beginning of the Spring Stage where they struggled early on. They look very good now, very, very clean. So I think that they should be the favorite here, and I am going to pick them to win this one. But I think it'll be a decently close series. So I'm going to say a 3-2 for the Dallas Fuel over Dreamers. I'm not fully sold on either of these teams right now, but I do think that they both are in a decent spot enough right now that they should be able to have a pretty solid banger of a match here on Sunday. Up next, we have the Hangzhou Spark taking on Panthera. I don't think Panthera is particularly a strong team in this region. I think the Spark are, so I think the Spark should be favored in this one pretty heavily. I think they'll take this one by a pretty one-sided 3-0 score. I think they're just a better team. Panthera, no offense. Losing Fate, I think, hurts their ability to become a kind of high-level contender in this region. I think the Spark are just too good to lose to Panthera. So Spark, to me, win this one with relative ease. Up next, we have the O2 Blast roster taking on Seoul Dynasty. Like I said before, O2 Blast, their new roster, not nearly as dominant as the one that we saw in the Spring Stage. So to me, this is a pretty easy win for the Dynasty if they are able to kind of get their stuff together. Vindane coming in should help this roster a lot, and they'll look a lot better as time goes on. And to me, O2 Blast is the easiest group or team in this group right now. I think they're the weakest looking team. I don't think they look very, very strong. So I think the Dynasty should take this one pretty easily. Score of 3-0. Just feels like that's where this is going here in a lot of games this weekend, unfortunately. But to me, Dynasty just the better looking team at the moment. Up next, a very interesting match. We have the London Spitfire versus the LA Valiant. Valiant, like I said before, coming off their first win of the season over the LA Gladiators. Spitfire coming off a rough week last weekend. They did not look great. They've struggled so far this season. Sauna, to me, this is the game that if Sauna's going to have a good matchup, this is his first kind of breakout game, potentially for London. But I really like what the Valiant did last week, and I think you have to feel like the Valiant might actually be the favorites in this game when you consider the fact that they looked much better last week. They looked like a much more complete team. I mean, they beat the Gladiators. They pushed the Defiant decently well. Spitfire, they had a decently tough schedule. They got pretty much rocked by New York, which, that's a little more in that way. And then they also lost to the Atlanta Reign, which there's no shame losing to the Reign. But in the Valiant right now look very, very good. I think Seeker's been very, very good this year. I think he's arguably the best player in this lobby, no matter whose team you're looking at. I think he's just that phenomenal. Liar looked a lot better. I think the Valiant having all that time off to just kind of get their team coordination going and really kind of figuring out how to play alongside each other helped them out quite a lot. And so I think the Valiant are going to take this one. I think the Valiant look the better team, and I think they're going to take this one by a score of 3-1. I don't think London should be expected to get rolled in this series. I still think they're good enough to kind of take maps here, but the Valiant look good. They're playing well. They're playing kind of loose and fun and free, and I think that really does help make a much stronger team, and so I think they take this one here over the Spitfire. Up next is the Atlanta Reign taking on the Toronto Defiant. Poor Defiant, starting off pretty well, not having to play too many tough games so far. Reign, different animal. You're not going to have much luck against the Atlanta Reign. If the Toronto Defiant are the first team to beat the Reign, that would be honestly quite funny when you consider the fact that just the Defiant is such a hyped up team this year with the American Tornado guys, and then they've gone through all this kind of stuff to change their roster, while the Reign have just been dominant all year. So it would be pretty funny, but I don't really expect it to happen. Like I said, to me, the Reign look like very unlikely they lose a game going into the playoffs. So yeah, I'm going to take the Reign dominantly, 3-0 win for them over the Defiant. The Reign have barely lost any maps this season. It's hard to think that this is a team they lose 1 or even 2, and definitely not 3 maps too. So yeah, sorry Defiant fans, but to me the Reign are the better looking team here. Final match of the weekend is the New York Excelsior and the Florida Mayhem. Once again, tough break for New York. Another very good team that they have to match up against. And I do not feel great about their chances against the Mayhem, who just look like to be like they're in one of the best kind of tiers of this league right now. They're equal roughly with teams like Boston and Houston and even potentially Atlanta. New York, they're good. They're not that good, and I think that they're going to struggle here. I think the addition of OG is phenomenal. I think he looks very, very good. I think being able to open up Fitz to really play his damage heroes to the majority of the time, be able to really let him play to his strengths, helps this team out a lot. But to me, the Mayhem, Chorong's been really good, RuPaul's been really good, Summer's been really good, Merritt and Checkmate have been really good. So it's hard to look at this Mayhem roster and they're going to lose to New York. So I do think Mayhem take this one by a score of 3-0. I think New York has a chance to do decently well in this series, but right now, nothing has really struck me as them being able to win a matchup against one of the best teams in the world. So that's it for my picks this week. Throw them on the screen real quick so you can take a look at them. Lots of interesting games this weekend. I'm excited to see the rematch of the Mid-Season Madness Finals. I'm excited to see the Boston-Florida rematch. I'm really intrigued by Dallas vs. Dreamers, so very cool weekend of matches. Really excited for these, so let me know your thoughts on any of my picks in the comments down below. Whether you agree or disagree with me, whatever it is, I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video and want more like it in the future, consider liking and subscribing. Your support does help out a bunch with the channel. That's all from me for today. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.